There's one motorcycle that I keep coming back to as I learn more about motorcycles and specifically retro motorcycles. When I first came across it, I didn't know a lot about the history of retro or modern classic motorcycles, so I didn't find it that interesting. But having spent countless hours researching and learning more about what we call modern classics, and learning what both big and small motorcycle manufacturers have to offer in this space, yeah, this bike continues to confuse me. See, retro motorcycles weren't really a thing, at least I thought they weren't, prior to Triumph's re-release of the Bonneville in 2000. So this bike literally forced every other manufacturer to change what their bikes look like over the next 20 years. I think it's impossible to really grasp the influence the new Triumph Bonnevilles had on the world of motorcycling. It's not just the fact that so many motorcycles now make a similar bike, also made to look just like the Bonneville of the 60s. Really, any emphasis on retro aesthetics, even on modern naked bikes, with round headlights, can be traced back in some way to the influence of the new Bonnevilles. A Honda CB650R, it has that round headlight and that sort of retro, neo-retro look, in part because of this movement started back in 2000 with the Bonneville. The movement of retro motorcycles has forced every motorcycle manufacturer to think about their design language. Now, modern classic motorcycles are one of the biggest segments in the market as a whole. That's how we have, loads of startup companies making bikes that look like this. Companies like Janus, for example, making entirely retro-inspired bikes, or even the resurgence of brands like Royal Enfield in the West, continuing to make motorcycles that just look and feel old and having success with those motorcycles. Or Ural. Nobody would have gotten on board with the idea of a $15,000 Russian sidecar motorcycle company without the influence of Triumph over the past few decades. Prior to 2000, though, nobody had really done what Triumph did with the Bonneville, a full-on copy, essentially, in terms of styling, of an old motorcycle, and especially an old British motorcycle. Harley had made some bikes, that look like they're older bikes for sure, but retro bikes today basically means old and British looking. That's basically the whole segment. Nobody had done this. Nobody. Well, actually Honda did, like 10 years before Triumph. Meet the Honda GB500, released in the 1989th year of our Lord, 1989. Now, this bike might not look that weird to you, and it didn't to me at first, until I started to see more and more and more of what was being made at this time, and let me tell you, this is a weird motorcycle for its time. It feels as though Honda sent someone into the future, like 20 years or 30 years into the future, to check out where the market was going, and that guy came back and said, yo, we need to make this. He was like, yeah, there's this motorcycle called the Continental GT, and it's cool, you need to make that, but better. I mean, look at this thing. It literally looks like the Continental GT, except the guy who went into the future didn't realize he should have brought back a picture of the Interceptor, not the GT. More on that later. Again, you might look at this and wonder, is this just an old motorcycle? Like, is it just actually old, not retro? Maybe that's what motorcycles looked like in 1989, who knows? The answer is no, absolutely no. In 1989, motorcycles looked like this, and this, and this. Oh, and don't forget this. So why did Honda decide to make this bike? Well, you should know that this bike is based actually on an even earlier bike that came out in 1985 in Japan, the Honda GB400, another retro sort of cafe racer style motorcycle. And that bike came out in two variations, a standard clubman style bike, we'll talk about what that means later, and then also one with a fairing, more like a true cafe racer, sort of old school race bike. The motivation behind these bikes was the same as the Bonneville when it was reintroduced, a factory attempt at sort of cashing in on the cafe racer craze. See, factories may not have been making bikes like this, but regular guys were. In the 80s, people were already starting to take old Honda CBs and other Japanese bikes, strip them down, switch out the handlebars for clip-ons. That style was already a thing. And when I say that this is the first retro motorcycle, what I mean is that this bike follows the current trend of retro motorcycles, namely a factory bike following the design of old British motorcycles. That is specifically what I mean when I say retro, a bike made to look old and British. In fact, the GB in Honda GB500 literally stood for Great Britain, and TT stands for Tourist Trophy, like the Isle of Man TT. This was a designation for British and European motorcycle racing. But Honda did one thing wrong with this motorcycle, and it's a big thing, and it's the thing that in 2000, 10 years later, Triumph did right. The Honda GB500 wasn't modeled after the right British motorcycles. It was modeled after the wrong ones. So when you look at the motorcycles that were successful in America in the 60s and 70s, names like the Triumph Bonneville, the Norton Commando, the BSA Gold Star, it's all the parallel twin bikes. It's the roadsters that Americans liked, that they went crazy over in the 60s and 70s. The Honda GB500 was not modeled after those bikes. It was modeled after a different segment of British motorcycles called clubman motorcycles. These were real purist, sort of enthusiast gentleman motorcycles, at least in the 60s they were. These were British bikes that stayed old. Even in the 60s, when the major manufacturers in Great Britain had moved on to bigger, faster, better things, there were some companies that continued to make this style of motorcycle. Clubman essentially refers to the handlebar style. Basically, it was a cheaper version of clip-ons, but with the Clubman style came a lot more, a sort of form and design to the motorcycle. Most notable is the Velocette Thruxton. It's really, it looks a lot like the GB500, honestly. Clubman bikes, like the Velocette, had a certain style, again besides just the low handlebars, the tank shape, and even more important, a big old British single-cylinder thumper, because companies like Velocette never moved on from the single. Even in the late 60s, they were making bikes that were relatively underpowered, while bikes like Norton, the Norton Commando were coming out producing well over 60 horsepower. The Velocette Thruxton costed significantly more than a Norton Commando or a Bonneville, but it made about 40 horsepower. So yeah, the twins were the way to go in this day for Americans. So the beloved British bikes like the Bonneville and the Commando and the BSA twins, they sold like crazy, while Velocette's big singles and even BSA's Clubman style bikes just didn't do well. See, Honda's GB500 was the wrong retro motorcycle. It was a simple misread of the American market, and because of that, it did really bad. Thousands of GB500s were shipped back, nobody really wanted them here, and they're actually pretty rare now. The big 500cc thumper produced less than 40 horsepower. The Velocette Thruxton, that it was obviously modeled after, was actually a more powerful bike 20 years earlier. Even today, you see this with the Royal Enfield twins. Which of the twins do better in terms of sales? Does the Interceptor or the Continental GT do better? Well, it's the Interceptor by a mile, because guess what? The Interceptor looks like an old British twin, it looks like the Bonneville, and the Continental GT just doesn't. It's that simple. Or even Royal Enfield's other retro motorcycles like the Classic never did anything compared to what the Interceptor does in terms of sales, and that's because it's the wrong British bike that it looks like. It looks like an old World War II bike. It doesn't look like the twins that Americans loved. So when Triumph released the Bonneville in 2000, the Western world literally ate it up. If Triumph had released the GB500, it might not have done so well. The market may have been more ready for a factory retro, but more than anything, it's the style, the aesthetic. The old dudes who owned a Bonneville when they were like 22 wanted to get it. Like 8 of them owned a Velocette Thruxton, hundreds of thousands of them rode a Triumph Twin, and even more rode a Honda but wished that they rode a Triumph Twin. Of course, there's more than just that. Triumph has the heritage themselves within their own company. You know, the fact that Triumph was making a Triumph Bonneville was a huge advantage. They were resurrecting one of their own bikes versus Honda, a company that just didn't ever make this kind of motorcycle. Coming out with a retro motorcycle in today's market is about the safest thing you can do. Heck, even Ducati did it, and the Ducati Scrambler is now one of their best-selling motorcycle platforms. But back in 1989, when Honda brought this thing to the West, this was not a safe bet, and I actually really respect that. Let's face it, today Honda makes safe motorcycles. Sure, they make the Fireblade, and that's all fun, but the primary focus of Honda is not to take risks with what they create, and honestly, I hate that. In the 80s and 90s, Honda made some crazy motorcycles, like seriously crazy engine configurations. We've got awesome bikes like the CBX 1050 or the Honda Rune. If Honda were to make a retro motorcycle today, they could still do it and it could be pretty safe. All they'd have to do is make a CB750 or CB500 retro bike that's at least inspired by those great Hondas of the early 70s. There's so many old dudes who would eat that up. It would sell. Like, look at how well the Monkey sells, just because of the simple fact that it looks like the old mini bikes of the 60s and 70s. Even though the GB500 didn't reach massive success here in the States or really anywhere, it's bikes like this that paved the way for the modern classic movement. In the same way, today it's not all just Triumphs. You have the Royal Enfield lineup, They've shown that you can make a compelling retro motorcycle that people love without needing to charge $10,000, and without needing as much of the electronics or performance that you get from a new Bonneville. If the Honda GB500 came out today with that great thumper engine at an affordable price, I think it would be successful because people want simple. They want bikes that are really back to the basics, but that's just my opinion. I could be wrong about all this. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this and maybe learned something about a bike that most people don't know anything about. Make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one and check out the playlist on retro motorcycles that's about to pop up. I've made quite a few videos on this stuff and you might find them interesting. All right, we'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.